The River and the Crown. Part 1. The Disguise. It was a foggy morning in the small village of Willow Bend. The river that ran through the village was the lifeline of the people. Traders, fishermen, and travelers moved up and down the water on large boats. For 14-year-old Victoria, the river was more than just a way to get food or goods. It was a dream of escape. Victoria was an orphan, living with old Mira, a kind but sickly woman who had raised her since she was a baby. Mira always said Victoria was too smart for her own good. But Victoria knew she had to be clever to survive. She ran errands, fixed fishing nets, and sometimes stole bread from the market when times were hard. One day, Victoria overheard something in the market. A group of men were talking about a big riverboat called the Silver Swan. It was leaving the next day and needed more crew members. The captain, a gruff man named Bran, paid well but only hired boys. Girls were not allowed on riverboats. That night, Victoria made her decision. If she stayed in Willow Bend, she would never leave the hard life she knew. But if she could get on that boat, she might see the world and make something of herself. She cut her long brown hair with Myra's sewing scissors, tied it back like a boy, and put on an old shirt and trousers she had taken from Myra's storage chest. When she looked in the cracked mirror, she hardly recognized herself. "Call me Tom," she said softly to her reflection, practicing her new name. Early the next morning, Victoria, now Tom, walked down to the docks. The Silver Swan was even bigger than she had imagined, with tall masts and wide decks. The crew was loading barrels and crates. She felt nervous, but she didn't stop. Captain Brand stood by the gangplank, yelling orders. He was a tall man with a beard as thick as a broom and eyes sharp as a hawk. When Victoria walked up to him, he gave her a quick, hard look. "What do you want, boy?" he barked. "I want to join your crew," Victoria said, keeping her voice low and steady. "I'm strong, and I can work hard." Bran raised an eyebrow. "Strong, eh? Let's see about that. Move that barrel over there." The barrel was heavy, but Victoria gritted her teeth and pushed it across the deck. Bran watched her the whole time, and when she finished, he nodded. "All right, you're in. But you mess up, you're off at the next port." "Got it?" "Yes, sir," Victoria said, hiding her smile. By noon, the Silver Swan set off down the river. Victoria's heart raced as she watched the village grow smaller and smaller behind her. For the first time, she felt free. But life on the boat was harder than Victoria expected. The crew woke up at dawn and worked until the stars came out. They scrubbed the decks, hauled ropes, and unloaded goods at every stop. Victoria's hands were soon covered in blisters, but she never complained. She couldn't risk anyone finding out she wasn't really a boy. One evening, after a long day, Victoria sat alone on the deck, watching the moonlight shimmer on the water. A boy about her age sat down next to her. His name was Finn, and he was the youngest crew member. He had messy blonde hair and a mischievous grin. "You're quiet, Tom," Finn said. "Most new boys either talk too much or quit by now." Victoria shrugged. I'm just here to work. Finn laughed. Well, you'll need more than that. Captain Bran's tough, but the river's tougher. You'll see. Victoria didn't reply, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Finn was watching her too closely, as if he could see through her disguise. As the days passed, Victoria grew stronger and faster. She also learned more about the river. It wasn't just a peaceful path of water. It was full of dangers, strong currents, hidden rocks, and thieves who attacked boats at night. But it was also beautiful, with wide skies, green shores, and towns full of new faces. One night, as the crew rested at a quiet port, Victoria heard something that made her ears perk up. Two men in dark cloaks were talking in hushed voices near the cargo hold. The package will be delivered in Rivermount, one man said. Good, said the other. The crown must fall, and this will make it happen. Victoria froze. The crown? Were they talking about the king? Before she could hear more, a loud noise startled the men, and they quickly disappeared into the shadows. Victoria stayed where she was, her mind racing. She had joined the boat to escape her small life, but now it seemed she had stepped into something much bigger and much more dangerous. Part 2. Whispers in the Dark. Victoria couldn't sleep that night. The words of the two men kept ringing in her head. The crown must fall. What did they mean? Were they planning something against the king? And why were they talking about Rivermount, the next big city on the river? The next morning, Victoria went back to work as usual, carrying barrels and tying ropes, but her mind was full of questions. She kept her eyes open, hoping to catch another glimpse of the two men, but they had disappeared. By the time the Silver Swan reached Rivermount, the crew was tired from the long journey. Rivermount was the biggest city Victoria had ever seen, with tall stone buildings, busy streets, and a market filled with colorful stalls. The boat docked near the market, and Captain Bran told the crew to unload the cargo. Quickly now, Bran shouted. We leave by sundown. As Victoria worked, she noticed a man in a fine blue coat standing on the dock. He didn't look like a trader or a sailor. He had a sharp, pointed face and eyes that seemed to see everything. He spoke to Bran for a few moments, then handed him a sealed envelope. Keep it safe, the man said in a low voice before walking away. Victoria's curiosity grew. What was in the envelope? And why did the man look so serious? She decided to stay close to Bran for the rest of the day. After unloading the cargo, Bran went to his cabin with the envelope. Victoria waited until the crew was busy and then crept toward the cabin. The door was slightly open, and she could see Bran sitting at his desk, reading the letter inside. His face grew dark as he read. He muttered something under his breath, crumpled the letter, and tossed it into a small wooden box. He locked the box and slid the key into his pocket before leaving the cabin. As soon as he was gone, Victoria slipped inside. She had to know what was in that letter. The box was locked tight, but Victoria had learned a trick or two in her years on the streets. She found a small nail in the corner of the room and used it to pick the lock. It took a few tries, but finally, the box clicked open. Inside was the crumpled letter. Victoria smoothed it out and read it quickly. The words were written in neat handwriting. The delivery is confirmed. The silver will bring the crown to its knees. Be ready. Victoria's heart raced. What delivery? What silver? And why was the crown in danger? She put the letter back in the box and locked it again. She didn't want Bran to know she had seen it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The crew finished their work, and the Silver Swan set off from Rivermount before the sun dipped below the horizon. But Victoria couldn't stop thinking about the letter. She needed answers. That night, as the crew rested, Victoria found Finn sitting on the deck, watching the stars. He was the only person she trusted, though she wasn't sure why. "Finn," she said, sitting next to him, "have you ever heard of something called the silver?" Finn looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Why do you ask?" "I just heard someone talking about it in Rivermount. It sounded important." Finn hesitated, then leaned closer. "I don't know much, but I've heard stories. Some people say the silver is code for a weapon. Something powerful enough to take down a king." Victoria's stomach turned. "A weapon?" Finn nodded. "But it's just a rumor. Why are you asking, Tom? Did you hear something?" Victoria shook her head quickly. "No. Just curious." Finn gave her a long look but didn't push further. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The crew was tense, and Captain Bran seemed more on edge than usual. He kept checking the wooden box in his cabin and snapping at anyone who got in his way. One evening, as the Silver Swan approached a narrow part of the river, Bran called the crew together. "Listen up," he said. "We're passing through dangerous waters. River thieves are common here, so stay alert. No one leaves their post." The crew nodded, but Victoria noticed Bran's hand hovering near his pocket, where he kept the key to the wooden box. That night, as Victoria stood on deck, she heard a faint splash in the water. She turned and saw a small boat gliding silently toward the Silver Swan. Shadows moved on the boat, and she realized they were armed men. "Thieves!" she shouted, running to the bell and ringing it as loud as she could. The crew scrambled to defend the boat. Bran pulled out a sword, and Finn grabbed a wooden pole. Victoria picked up a heavy rope and swung it at one of the thieves who climbed aboard. The thief stumbled back, falling into the river. The fight was chaotic, but the crew managed to drive the thieves away. As the last thief jumped back into their boat, Bran yelled, "Get out of here or I'll gut you myself." The thieves disappeared into the night, and the crew cheered. But Victoria noticed something strange. Bran wasn't cheering. He was staring at the wooden box in his cabin, his face pale. Later that night, when everyone else was asleep, Victoria crept back to the cabin. The box was still there, but the key was gone. Bran must have hidden it somewhere else. Victoria leaned against the door, her mind racing. The thieves weren't just after gold or goods. They were after something much more dangerous. And somehow, Victoria knew the answer was in that box. Part 3. The Hidden Key. The days following the attack were quiet, but Victoria's mind was anything but calm. She couldn't stop thinking about the letter and the thieves. She was certain that whatever was in the wooden box was connected to the plot against the king. But without the key, she couldn't get inside again. Captain Bran had become even more cautious since the attack. He carried the key with him everywhere, sometimes patting his coat pocket as if to check it was still there. Victoria knew she couldn't risk taking it directly from him. She needed a plan. One evening, as the boat stopped at a small riverside village to restock supplies, Victoria decided to follow Bran. She stayed back, careful to keep out of sight, as Bran walked to the local inn. He met with a man wearing a dark cloak and handed him a small package. They spoke quietly, but Victoria managed to catch a few words. "Deliver this to the contact. Rivermount wasn't safe," Bran said. The cloaked man nodded. "The crown must fall. You'll hear from us soon." Victoria felt her stomach twist. It was true, Bran was part of the plot. After Bran left the inn, Victoria followed him back to the boat. She hid behind a stack of barrels, her heart pounding as she watched him enter his cabin. When he emerged a few moments later, she saw him lock the door behind him and slip the key into his boot. The boot, Victoria whispered to herself. That was where he was hiding the key. The next morning, Victoria went about her tasks as usual, but her mind was racing. How could she get the key out of Bran's boot without being caught? She knew she had to act fast. If Bran was delivering packages and messages, the plot against the king could unfold at any moment. By the time the crew stopped at the next port, Victoria had a plan. That evening, as the crew sat around a small fire on the deck, Finn started telling one of his usual wild stories about fighting river pirates. Most of the crew laughed and cheered as Finn acted out the battle, pretending to swing a sword and fall over dramatically. Victoria used the distraction to slip closer to Bran. He was sitting on a barrel, polishing a small knife, his boots resting on the deck. "Captain Bran," she said, her voice steady, "do you need more water for cleaning the knives? I can fetch some." Bran looked up, grunted, and handed her a bucket. "Make it quick, boy." Victoria grabbed the bucket and pretended to trip, spilling water near his feet. "Watch it," Bran barked, standing up and shaking the water off his boots. "Sorry, sir," Victoria said, kneeling quickly and pretending to clean up the mess. Her hands trembled as she reached for the boot where the key was hidden. Her fingers brushed against the leather, and she felt the cold metal of the key. Carefully, she slipped it out and hid it in her sleeve before standing up. "I'll get more water," she said quickly, hurrying away before Bran could notice. That night, when the rest of the crew was asleep, Victoria snuck into Bran's cabin with the key. She locked the door behind her and lit a small lantern. Her hands shook as she opened the wooden box. Inside, she found a second letter and a small, wrapped object. The letter read, The silver weapon is nearly complete. The final piece will arrive at the capital soon. Ensure it reaches the hands of our allies in the palace. The king's days are numbered. Victoria unwrapped the object and gasped. It was a small, intricate silver mechanism, unlike anything she had ever seen. It looked like a part of a larger machine with gears and levers that gleamed in the lantern light. "What is this?" she whispered. Before she could examine it further, she heard footsteps outside the cabin. Panic surged through her. She quickly rewrapped the mechanism, put it back in the box, and locked it. She hid the key under a loose plank in the floor and blew out the lantern just as the door handle rattled. "Tom, what are you doing here?" Bran's voice was like thunder. Victoria turned, her mind racing for an excuse. I thought I heard something, Captain. I wanted to make sure everything was safe." Bran's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, then at the wooden box. He grabbed her by the collar. "You think I'm stupid, boy? You've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong." "What did you see?" "Nothing, sir. I swear." Victoria lied, trying to keep her voice calm. Bran glared at her for what felt like an eternity before shoving her toward the door. "Get out. And if I catch you near my cabin again, you'll be swimming back to shore. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Victoria said, hurrying out. Victoria couldn't sleep after that. She sat on the deck, staring at the dark river, her thoughts a tangled mess. She now knew for sure that Bran was involved in a plot to overthrow the king. But what could she do? She was just a girl in disguise, stuck on a riverboat with no one to trust. Finn found her there, sitting alone under the stars. "Tom, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, sitting beside her. Victoria hesitated. Should she tell Finn the truth? He had always been kind to her, but could she trust him with a secret this big? Finally, she took a deep breath. "Finn, if you knew something bad was going to happen, but you didn't know how to stop it, what would you do?" Finn frowned. "Depends on how bad it is. Are we talking about trouble with Bran, or something bigger?" Victoria looked away. "Something bigger. Much bigger." Finn was quiet for a moment, then said, "If it's that big, you can't handle it alone. You'll need help." Victoria nodded, but inside, she felt more alone than ever. She had no idea where to find help, or if she could stop the danger in time. As the Silver Swan sailed deeper into the heart of the river, Victoria knew one thing for sure. Her journey was no longer just about escape. It was about courage and finding a way to protect the kingdom, even if no one else believed she could. Part 4. Allies in the Shadows. Victoria's days on the Silver Swan became more tense after her close call with Captain Bran. Every glance from him felt sharper, every word heavier. She avoided his cabin and worked hard to keep her head down, but her thoughts never rested. The mysterious silver mechanism and the letter haunted her. She had to stop whatever the plotters were planning. But how? Who could she trust? Her chance came one quiet evening. The boat had docked at a bustling port town. larger than the others they had visited. Victoria watched as the crew went about their tasks, and Bran disappeared into the crowd, likely for another secret meeting. She slipped away from the boat, keeping her disguise as Tom intact, and wandered through the market. It was noisy and chaotic, with vendors shouting about their goods and customers bargaining loudly. Victoria kept her eyes open, searching for someone, anyone, who might help. That's when she saw him. A man in a long, dark coat stood at the edge of the market, watching everything with a calm, calculating gaze. His face was sharp, with a trimmed beard and piercing eyes that seemed to see through the noise and chaos. Victoria felt drawn to him, though she wasn't sure why. Summoning her courage, she approached him. "Excuse me, sir." He turned his gaze on her, and she almost faltered. "What do you want, boy?" Victoria hesitated, then decided to take a risk. "I need help. The kind of help that doesn't ask too many questions." The man raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. And why would I help you?" Victoria glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in and whispered, "Because I know about the plot against the king." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew sharper. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into a quiet alley. "Who are you? And how do you know about that?" Victoria took a deep breath. "I'm just a crew member on the Silver Swan, but I overheard things. Captain Bran is involved. I found a letter and something important, but I can't stop them alone." The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "My name is Corwin. I work for the king. You've just put yourself in more danger than you can imagine, boy. But if you're telling the truth, you might have just become very useful." Corwin led Victoria to a small, hidden tavern on the edge of town. Inside, a group of people sat around a table, talking in hushed voices. "These are my allies," Corwin said, introducing her to the group. "They've been working to uncover the conspiracy against the king." Victoria felt a spark of hope for the first time. Maybe she wasn't alone after all. She told them everything she knew: the attack on the boat, the secret packages, the silver mechanism, and Bran's involvement. The group listened carefully, their faces growing darker with every word. "This mechanism you found," one of them said. "It could be part of a weapon. The conspirators might be planning to attack the king directly." Victoria nodded. "I don't know much about machines, but it looked important. Bran said something about delivering it to the capital." Corwin leaned forward. "If they're moving it to the capital, we don't have much time. We need to intercept it before it gets there. Can you get us back on the Silver Swan?" Victoria hesitated. "I think so, but it won't be easy. Bran already suspects me. If he finds out I've been talking to you..." Corwin placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than most would in your position, Victoria. If we work together, we can stop this. But we'll need your help." Victoria took a deep breath. "All right. I'll do it. But you have to promise to protect the crew. Most of them don't know anything about this." They're just trying to make a living. Corwin nodded. We'll do our best. The next day, Victoria returned to the Silver Swan with Corwin and his allies disguised as new crew members. She introduced them to the others, saying they had been hired to help with the journey to the capital. Bran was suspicious but allowed them to stay. Fine. But if any of you step out of line, you'll answer to me. Corwin gave Victoria a small nod, and she knew they were one step closer to stopping the conspiracy. Over the next few days, Victoria worked with Corwin and his team to gather more information. They kept a close watch on Bran, following his movements and listening to his conversations. One night, Victoria and Corwin sneaked into Bran's cabin while he was meeting with one of his contacts. Using the key Victoria had hidden earlier, they opened the wooden box and examined the mechanism more closely. It's definitely part of a weapon, Corwin said. And a dangerous one at that. If this reaches the conspirators in the capital, the king won't stand a chance. Victoria's heart sank. Then we have to stop it. But how? Corwin looked at her, his expression grim. We'll need to act before we reach the capital. Once we're there, it'll be too late. The group spent the next day preparing. They planned to sabotage the delivery by intercepting the mechanism before Bran could hand it over to his contact in the capital. But things didn't go as smoothly as they hoped. Bran grew more suspicious of Victoria and the new crew members. He started questioning them more frequently, watching their every move. "You've been acting strange, boy," he said to Victoria one afternoon. "If I find out you've been lying to me..." Victoria forced herself to stay calm. "I'm just doing my job, sir." But inside, she was terrified. The tension on the boat grew thicker with each passing day. As they approached the capital, Victoria knew the final confrontation was near. On the last night before they reached the capital, a heavy storm rolled in. The river became wild and dangerous, tossing the Silver Swan like a toy. Victoria and Corwin used the chaos to their advantage. While the crew was busy trying to keep the boat steady, they snuck into Bran's cabin to retrieve the mechanism. But Bran wasn't as distracted as they had hoped. He caught them in the act. "What do you think you're doing?" he roared, drawing his knife. Victoria and Corwin froze. The storm howled outside, and the cabin seemed to shrink under Bran's furious gaze. "We know what you're planning," Corwin said, stepping in front of Victoria. "It's over, Bran. You're not getting this to the capital." Bran laughed coldly. "You think you can stop me? You don't know who you're dealing with." The storm shook the boat violently, and the confrontation turned into chaos. Bran lunged at Corwin, and Victoria grabbed the mechanism, clutching it tightly as the cabin door flew open, letting in the raging wind and rain. The fight had begun, and the fate of the kingdom rested in Victoria's hands. Part 5. The Battle on the River. The storm raged as if the heavens themselves were angry. The Silver Swan groaned under the weight of the wind and water, swaying violently with the angry current. Inside Bran's cabin, the air was thick with tension. Bran's knife gleamed in the flickering light of the oil lamp, and his eyes burned with fury. He moved toward Victoria and Corwin, the boats rocking, making his steps uneven but no less menacing. Victoria's heart raced. She clutched the silver mechanism tightly, refusing to let go. Corwin, though smaller than Bran, stood firm between the captain and her. "You don't have to do this, Bran," Corwin shouted over the roar of the storm. "Surrender now, and we'll make sure you're treated fairly." Bran sneered. "Fair? Do you think the king ever treated us fairly? Do you think the crown cares about people like us?" Corwin's voice was steady. "This isn't the way. You're just putting innocent lives at risk." Bran lunged suddenly, and Corwin dodged, the knife narrowly missing him. The two men grappled, crashing into the cabin walls as the boat tilted wildly. Victoria knew she had to act. Clutching the mechanism, she bolted for the door, hoping to escape and keep it safe. But Bran noticed her movement. "Stop, boy!" he roared, breaking away from Corwin. Victoria didn't stop. She ran out into the storm, rain lashing her face and wind pulling at her clothes. The deck was slick and dangerous, and crew members were scrambling to secure the boat against the storm. She slipped but caught herself on the railing, her fingers gripping the mechanism tightly. She had to hide it or destroy it. Anything to keep it out of Bran's hands. Bran burst onto the deck, his knife still in hand. Corwin followed close behind, shouting for him to stop. "Victoria!" Corwin yelled, his voice barely audible over the storm. Bran's eyes locked onto Victoria. "Give it to me, boy. You don't understand what you're holding." Victoria backed away, her mind racing. The mechanism was small but heavy, its metal surface cold against her skin. She glanced at the raging river below. Could she throw it overboard? Would that end it? But Bran seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't even think about it," he growled, stepping closer. Corwin lunged at Bran, grabbing his arm and trying to wrestle the knife away. The two men struggled fiercely, slipping and sliding on the wet deck. Victoria took the chance to run toward the stern of the boat, hoping to find a place to hide the mechanism. But the storm was relentless, and the boat swayed dangerously, nearly knocking her off balance. Suddenly, Bran broke free from Corwin and charged after her. Victoria's heart pounded as she reached the edge of the deck. There was nowhere left to run. Bran stood a few feet away, his knife raised. "Hand it over," he demanded. "You don't know what you're doing." Victoria gripped the mechanism tighter. "I know enough," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "This isn't about justice. It's about power. And I won't let you have it." Bran stepped closer, and Victoria glanced at the river again. She knew what she had to do, but fear gripped her. Could she really destroy it? Corwin's voice cut through the storm. "Victoria, don't let him win." With a deep breath, Victoria made her decision. She raised the mechanism high and hurled it into the river with all her strength. "No!" Bran shouted, his voice filled with rage. The mechanism hit the water and disappeared beneath the waves. Bran lunged at her, but Corwin tackled him just in time. The two men fell to the deck, sliding dangerously close to the edge. The crew, realizing something was happening, rushed to help. Two strong sailors grabbed Bran, pulling him away from Corwin. Bran struggled, but he was outnumbered. "You're finished," Corwin said, standing over him. Bran's eyes burned with fury, but he said nothing. The sailors tied him up and dragged him below deck, locking him in the storage room. Victoria collapsed against the railing, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Corwin came to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said. "I hope so," Victoria replied, her voice barely audible over the storm. The crew worked together to stabilize the boat and steer it through the storm. By the time the skies began to clear, the Silver Swan was battered but still afloat. The next morning, the boat docked in a small village not far from the capital. Corwin and his allies took Bran into custody, promising to deliver him to the king's guards. Victoria watched as they led him away. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a lingering fear of what might come next. Corwin turned to her. "You're braver than most, Victoria. The kingdom owes you a great debt." Victoria shook her head. "I just did what I had to do." He smiled. "That's what makes you a hero." The crew of the Silver Swan gathered around her, their faces filled with gratitude. "We didn't know what was going on," one of them said. "But you saved us, Victoria. You saved all of us." For the first time, Victoria felt a sense of belonging. She wasn't just an orphan or a runaway. She was part of something bigger. As the boat prepared to continue its journey, Victoria stood at the railing, watching the river flow. The silver mechanism was gone, but its story wasn't over. The kingdom still had its dangers, and Victoria knew her adventure was far from finished. She smiled, feeling the sun on her face and the wind in her hair. Whatever came next, she was ready. Part 6. The King's Court. The journey to the capital was long but peaceful after the storm. The crew of the Silver Swan worked together to repair the ship, their spirits lifted after Bran's capture. Victoria found herself helping with the work, earning the crew's respect. For the first time, they began to treat her not as a boy or an outsider, but as one of their own. When the capital city came into view, Victoria couldn't believe her eyes. The towering castle stood proudly on a hill, its golden spires gleaming in the sunlight. The river wound through the bustling city, its waters reflecting the vibrant market stalls, narrow streets, and grand buildings. Corwin and Victoria disembarked at the docks, accompanied by several of the king's guards who had met them along the way. They escorted Bran, bound in chains, to the palace. Victoria had never been anywhere so grand. The palace gates were carved with intricate designs of lions and eagles, symbols of the kingdom's strength. Inside, the walls were lined with tapestries, and the floors shone like mirrors. Servants and courtiers moved swiftly through the halls, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. But Victoria had little time to marvel at her surroundings. The guards led them straight to the throne room, where the king awaited. The throne room was enormous, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of sunlight. At the far end, the king sat on a grand throne made of gold and silver. He was an older man with a stern face, his crown resting heavily on his head. Beside him stood a woman with sharp eyes and a cold expression, his chief advisor, Lady Marlowe. As the group approached, the king's voice boomed. "Who dares to bring such chaos to my kingdom?" Corwin stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, we bring you Bran, the traitor who sought to overthrow the throne. He conspired to use a stolen mechanism to destroy the crown's power." The king's eyes narrowed as he looked at Bran. "Is this true?" Bran raised his head defiantly. "The crown has never cared for the people. I did what I thought was right. By risking innocent lives?" The king thundered. "You will answer for your crimes." The guards dragged Bran away, but before he left, he turned to Victoria. "This isn't over," he growled. Victoria shivered but stood her ground. As the room quieted, Lady Marlowe's sharp gaze fell on Victoria. "And who is this child?" she asked. Corwin gestured toward her. "This is Victoria." Without her courage, the mechanism would have fallen into Bran's hands. She risked her life to save the kingdom. The king's expression softened as he looked at Victoria. "You are brave, child. What is your story?" Victoria hesitated. For so long, she had hidden the truth of who she was. But now, in the presence of the king, she felt she could finally speak. "I'm no one, Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Just an orphan who wanted to survive. But when I saw what Bran was planning, I couldn't stand by and do nothing." The king nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the greatest heroes come from the most unlikely places." Lady Marlowe, however, looked unconvinced. "The mechanism is still missing. Without it, we cannot truly secure the kingdom." Corwin stepped forward. "The mechanism was destroyed, Lady Marlowe." Victoria made sure of it. A flicker of relief crossed the king's face, but Lady Marlowe's expression remained cold. "Destroyed? Do you understand what you've done, boy?" Victoria met her gaze. "I stopped it from falling into the wrong hands. That's all that matters." The room fell silent. Finally, the king spoke. "You did what you thought was right. For that, we owe you our thanks." The king offered Victoria a place in the palace, a chance to learn and grow under his protection. But Victoria hesitated. The palace was beautiful, but it wasn't her home. Her heart belonged to the river and the freedom it offered. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said. "But I don't think I belong here. There's so much more of the world I want to see." The king smiled. "A wise choice. The world needs people like you. People who are willing to fight for what's right, no matter the cost." He turned to Corwin. "And you, Captain, have proven your loyalty. I trust you will keep watch over her." Corwin grinned. With my life, your majesty. As the Silver Swan prepared to leave the capital, Victoria stood at the dock, watching the busy city one last time. Corwin joined her, a knowing smile on his face. You're going to make a fine sailor, Victoria, he said. Victoria laughed. I'll never be just a sailor, Corwin. There's too much adventure out there waiting for me. He chuckled. That's what I like about you. You're always looking for the next challenge. The crew cheered as Victoria climbed aboard. She felt a warmth in her chest, a sense of belonging she had never known before. As the Silver Swan sailed down the river, the wind carried the promise of new adventures. Victoria stood at the bow, the sun on her face and the world stretching out before her. She had faced danger, fought for what was right, and found her place among people who believed in her. And she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.